Vladimir Putin has issued a warning to the West, insisting that any country that meddles in Russia's affairs would live to regret their actions.
Но надеюсь, что никому не придет в голову перейти в отношении России так называемую красную черту.
Putin's main political opponent, Alexei Navalny, who survived Novichok poisoning last year, has been detained once again on trumped-up charges. He has just ended a hunger strike of 24 days. Russia had also recently deployed more than 100,000 troops to the border with Ukraine. Russia now says it will pull them back. But it was a worrying reminder of 2014, when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea. What will be the impact of these actions? And how will the world respond? Our experts answer your questions. What does Navalny represent for Russia?
Navalny, since he's returned, has gained not just the stature as a politician. He basically moved from reality, from the realm of everyday sort of politics, into the stuff of mythology and fables. He's captured the imagination of the world. The most famous actors, writers, poets are signing letters on his behalf, demanding that he is allowed medical care. He's captured the imagination of young people, both in Russia and outside.
How should America be responding to what's going on in Russia?
The US and other Western countries are having to think through potential consequences, not just for Navalny's treatment, but also for a host of other situations. In the past couple of weeks, we have seen, for example, a major military build-up on Ukraine's borders, and so there are potential consequences for that. We have seen the Czech Republic point to or blame Russian military intelligence for an explosion that took place on that country in 2014. And America, of course, in the past 2 or 3 weeks, has also expelled Russian diplomats. It has imposed sanctions on Russia for cyber activity, a major cyber espionage campaign known as SolarWinds, and all manner of other kinds of Russian policy. And so I think the challenge in thinking of consequences is not only how do you send a signal, how do you calibrate these consequences. So, for example, if you use all your sanctions now in response to Navalny, what do you have left in reserve if there is a Russian attack in eastern Ukraine, for instance? And I think the other challenge is, at least for the United States, is that although they want to send a tough message, they also want to hold out the possibility of dialogue. I think that's the American approach to this. They don't want to simply squeeze Russia or impose punishing, swinging costs on the regime without leaving anything left for future actions.
Do sanctions actually work? If not, what other options are there?
I mean, they have worked in some ways. Whether they've achieved what they were meant to achieve is a different question. They worked in certainly imposing a cost on Russian economy, making it more isolated, contributing to stagnation. Whether they've deterred Russia or if they changed Putin's behavior, I don't think they have at all. Russia has shifted to a different economic model after sanctions were imposed. It became much more of a sort of a siege economy where the emphasis is on protecting it from external shocks, on building reserves, on reducing debt, rather than on growth. So sanctions certainly have hurt, but they, to my mind, they were always about the West has to do something, so let's do that because we don't really have an alternative. But maybe Shashank does know of sort of other more innovative ways.
I think one interesting thing we see in the cyber domain in response to Russian cyber activity, whether that's espionage or disruptive and destructive activity in cyberspace, has been naming and shaming. That is, countries like the US, the UK, and other Europeans publicly laying out the evidence about what Russian intelligence agencies are doing in cyberspace in ways that they never would have done 10 or 15 years ago. They name and shame not just intelligence agencies, but individual Russian hackers working for the SVR or the GRU or the FSB, different Russian intelligence agencies. And so there's a shift from big punishing economic sanctions to targeted individual sanctions, often against individual intelligence officers or hackers, in ways that expose their activity, embarrass them, and constrain their behavior. Whether it has had a substantial effect on Russian behavior, perhaps that's too early to say, but I think it is indicative of the evolving apparatus of pressure on Russia that the West is developing.
What was Putin's aim in building up troops on the Ukrainian border?
Well, between March and April, Russia built up over 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine and in Crimea to the south. On April 22nd, Russia's defense minister said the routine exercise, as he called it, was complete and all the troops would be going home as planned. Now, it wasn't a routine exercise, we know that. This was the biggest build-up of Russian forces on eastern Ukraine and in Crimea since 2014, which is the year, of course, that Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. So this was not routine. This was a very unusual, even an extraordinary build-up of forces on a very large and substantial scale, matched by some very menacing rhetoric coming out of Russia. What was the point of it all? Well, it's hard to say. Even Western intelligence agencies, I think, struggled to understand Russian motivations, and that was the point. Russia was keeping its options open. I think part of this was about Russia's domestic circumstances. It was embattled, besieged at home with Navalny and the protests. It may also have been about a new American president coming into office, Joe Biden, changing American policy on Russia in a much more robust direction. So this may have been a test for the White House. But above all, I think this was really an effort to intimidate Ukraine. So this was probably an act of what the experts call coercive diplomacy, muscle flexing, intimidation against Ukraine in the hope of extracting concessions. If that was the purpose, it didn't succeed. We didn't actually see any tangible concessions handed over from Ukraine to Russia, and Russia has returned home, sent its troops back to barracks with a summit promised by Joe Biden, but very little else to show for it.
What would happen if Russia tries to annex more of Ukraine in the future?
I think the response will be very severe. It looks for now as though the worst of the military crisis is over. If we do indeed see Russian troops moving away from the border, and that is yet to be evidenced, we'll have to wait and see. If that does happen, I think the risk of a Russian offensive against Ukraine has diminished substantially. But if there was a substantial escalation in the Donbass, if we did see a Russian effort to increase the pressure there, or if Russia were to keep its troops in place and to keep that military threat against Ukraine and to use those forces, there's a limit to how far the West is willing to support Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of the NATO alliance. But on the other hand, there is a recognition that a change in the status quo, an attack from Crimea, an attack in eastern Ukraine, would represent the biggest crisis in European security for many years. And I think we would undoubtedly see a fresh round of sanctions against Russia. It would prompt a much tighter relationship between Ukraine and the West, and a pretty strong economic, diplomatic, and even military response from Europe and America. I'm Shashank Joshi, Defence Editor at The Economist. If you'd like to read more of our Russia coverage, please click on the link. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.